Good evening. Once again, the Web Healing Show. And today's topic is powerlessness to empowerment. Well, we all know very well that there's a limit to the kind of power and the amount of power that we have over anyone or anything. Even if we think that the so called powerful people, like ministers or politicians or some bigwigs, they're very, very powerful, but they're the ones who need maximum security. Are they really powerful? Are they being dictated by others who are more powerful? Well, the question you only can answer. We all know that there is a limit to the level of powers that anybody could ever have. Sometimes I feel that so called God also doesn't have enough power. Humans can overrule some of the powers by their free will, right? So power is often limited. And when we understand the limits of the power, we often feel powerless, and it's not a happy feeling. When we do not have power over others, when we do not have power over our own health, our own body at times, or the finances, or the system as such, and the sheer powerlessness makes you feel so low and so terrible about self. And more than that, when you really want to help somebody and you feel powerless, you are a surgeon, and when you know you can't save your child with your surgery, you feel powerless. You are a gynecologist and can't help your own daughter or wife in gynecological issues, you feel powerless. You're a healer and you can't heal yourself. You may feel powerless. You could be a financial wizard, but you can't do anything about your finances and you could feel powerless. It's amazing how, in spite of having all the means and resources, still often we feel powerless. Strange are the ways of the world. And yet, more than half the population in the world are trying to gather more and more power so that they never have to face any situation where they feel powerless. And in spite of having all the means, at times, you often come across the moment where you feel so powerless. Here's a solution to it: rediscover your potentials. You may have limited powers, but you have unlimited potentials. Now, what are those potentials? You remember just a day before exams, how much did you remember and how much you could study? Well, you remember when you actually had to push yourself and save your life, how much could you run? There are times when there are emergencies and crises, you'll end up doing something so amazing that you never thought you would be able to do it. Did you have that power? Imagine a woman who's 35, 40 kg, frail, and have a baby trapped under a huge vehicle. A woman who would never be able to carry even the 20 kg suitcase would topple the vehicle to save her baby. And it's quite possible there are recorded cases. How does that happen? Do you think that woman has the power? No. She has the potential to do that. So, what is that potential? Potential comes from the divine intervention. It's always handy when you need it the most. Unfortunately, we never rely on our potentials. We only call upon that potential under the circumstances when there are deadlines, there are crises, when there are emergency situations, and suddenly you call upon that help, that support, that intervention, which can help you sail through beyond your imagination, and it's got nothing to do with your power. If at all, it's your power to get in touch with your potential. That's it. So get in touch with your potential even when you are not under crisis, when you're not suffering, when there is no emergency. On a daily basis, operate from potential and operate from your full, and the fullest potential. And that's what will make your life worthwhile. And I'm sure you all have it. It's just a matter of training yourself and your subconscious mind to keep operating from your true potentials. And that is true empowerment. The day you discover your full potential, you're truly empowered. And when you're truly empowered, you don't have to chase powers. You don't have to gather powers. You don't have to amass the power. You don't have to worry about power because you know you are the power. Your potential is the true power. And that's when you do not feel powerless ever. So that's the message for today. And let me welcome everyone who's come over here and participated. Thank you so much. I can see my regular buddies, and it's awesome. Everything that you comment upon inspire me to keep having more and more potentials to serve you, to come out with better and better topics. It's you who have a potential to get the best out of me. Thank you so much for joining, and keep being regular, keep sharing, and keep giving me feedback. So, I'm going to give you some of the radical statements that can bring out your potential in a much better way. And these statements are very, very powerful, simple statements. If they do not make any sense, it's okay. Just go through the book Radical Crystalline Mind, and you will figure out the logic and the reasons and the whole understanding how the statements are designed, and you'll be able to design for yourself as well. I'm going to give a small little gap between the statements so that you can recite after me. Thank you so much, and let's start. Close your eyes and take a few deep breaths in. Breathe in through your nose and breathe out through your mouth. Continue. Breathing in through your nose and breathe out through your mouth. Breathe in a lot of positive energy and breathe out stresses, worries, fears, frustrations, and mainly the powerlessness. Breathe in the inspiration and breathe out the powerlessness. Breathe in the divine intervention and breathe out the powerlessness. Breathe in the divine assistance and breathe out the powerlessness. Breathe in love for everyone. And breathe out, powerlessness. Now, recite after me. I revive my powerlessness. I recognize my powerlessness. I realign my powerlessness. I reorient my powerlessness. I reposition my powerlessness. I revive my powerlessness. I recognize my powerlessness. I realign my powerlessness. I reorient my powerlessness. I reposition my powerlessness. I revive my powerlessness. I recognize my powerlessness. I realign my powerlessness. I reorient my powerlessness. I reposition my powerlessness. I revive the reasons for my powerlessness. I recognize the reasons for my powerlessness. I realign the reasons for my powerlessness. I reorient the reasons for my powerlessness. I reposition the reasons for my powerlessness. I revive the reasons for my powerlessness. I recognize the reasons for my powerlessness. I realign the reasons for my powerlessness. I reorient the reasons for my powerlessness. I reposition the reasons for my powerlessness. I revive my need for power. I recognize my need for power. I realign my need for power. I reorient my need for power. I reposition my need for power. I revive my need for power. I recognize my need for power. I realign my need for power. I reorient my need for power. I reposition my need for power. I revive my need for power. I recognize my need for power. I realign my need for power. I reposition my need for power. I revive my reasons for need for power. I recognize my reasons for the need for power. I realign my reasons for the need for power. I reorient my reasons for the need for power. I reposition the reasons for my need for power. I revive the brilliance and powerlessness. I recognize the brilliance in the powerlessness. I realign the brilliance in the powerlessness. I reorient the brilliance and the powerlessness. I reposition the brilliance and the powerlessness. I revive my association of powerlessness with growth. I recognize my association of powerlessness with growth. I realign my association of powerlessness with growth. I reorient my association of powerlessness with growth. I reposition my association of powerlessness with growth. I revive my potentials. I recognize my potentials. I realign my potentials. I reorient my potentials. I reposition my potentials. I revive my potentials. I recognize my potentials. I realign my potentials. I reorient my potentials. I reposition my potentials. I revive my need to discover my potentials. I recognize my need to discover my potential. I realign my need to discover my potential. I reorient my need to discover my potential. I reposition my need to discover my potential. I revive my empowerment. I recognize my empowerment. I realign my empowerment. I reorient my empowerment. I revive my fear of empowerment. I recognize my fear of empowerment. I realign my fear of empowerment. I reorient my fear of empowerment. I reposition my fear of empowerment. I revive my unhealthy associations with empowerment. I recognize my unhealthy associations with empowerment. I realign my unhealthy associations with empowerment. I reorient my unhealthy associations with empowerment. I reposition my unhealthy associations with empowerment. I revive my fear of being arrogant with empowerment. I recognize my fear of being arrogant with empowerment. I realign my fear of being arrogant with empowerment. I reposition my fear of being arrogant with empowerment. I reorient my fear of being arrogant with empowerment. I reposition my fear of getting arrogant with empowerment. I revive my fear of being lonely with empowerment. I recognize my fear of being lonely with empowerment. I realign my fear of being lonely with empowerment. I reorient my fear of being lonely with empowerment. I reorient my fear of being lonely with empowerment. I reposition my fear of being lonely with empowerment. I revive my potential to be empowered. I recognize my potential to be empowered. I realign my potential to be empowered. I reorient my potential to be empowered. I reposition my potential to be empowered. I revive the rediscovery of my empowered self. I recognize my rediscovery of my empowered self. I realign my rediscovery of my empowered self. I reorient my rediscovery of my empowered self. I reposition my rediscovery of my empowered self. I revive my empowered self. I recognize my empowered self. I realign my empowered self. I reorient my empowered self. I reposition my empowered self. This is Aatmn Parmar reciting radical statements on empowerment. We select every day new topic to bring out the best in you. Keep listening and stay tuned. Thank you for joining.